Since this is a post-lunch slot, this is going to be a cute talk with lots of baby pictures and no equations. So what I'll do in the next half an hour is to give you an overview of a research program that we've started a couple of years ago. And this is truly a collaborative project between myself, Vicky Southgate, and most importantly, Katarina Begrush, who is there in the audience, because all of the experimental work that you will see is part of her PhD, and it's her work. So a bit of background on us and what we're interested in. So we're mainly interested the reason we approach question of what curiosity is and how it works. We're interested in learning, and more particularly in what is special about infant learning, and also whether there is something special about human infant learning. And in the past I'd say decade, there's this view that has emerged in the developmental literature that one thing that is special about humans is that they dedicate a lot of energy to teaching others, and that human culture is actually resulting from this huge energy going into transmitting information. And so what that means is that human adults would do a lot of things, and they are in charge of knowing what the infant has to learn and when the infant should learn those things, or when it's the most optimal time for the infant to learn information. And the adult does a lot of things to facilitate learning, to make the world learnable, and these are just a few experimentally or observationally demonstrated adaptations that allow and improve learning. So the mothers monitoring infant attention, using particular cues to grab their attention, like infant-directed speech, and to also tell them that that information is generic knowledge, using demonstration, scaffolding, sampling the world, or making changing the world so that it conveys a certain type of information. So for example, for category learning, sampling different elements of a category to demonstrate a property is something that needs to be generalized at the category level. Slowing down whatever they do, so speech or movement. Without in any way contradicting the necessity of these adaptations, we also had the intuition that truly infant learning doesn't always happen in this situation where you have mom and child in a one-to-one interaction, and often, and this is maybe even more the case in traditional societies or tens of years, thousands of years ago, there will be always a one-to-many relationship where siblings have to compete for an adult's attention, and there will also be situations in which the adult is not present. So this is not a talk about which of these strategies was more successful evolutionary, or nor is it about whether listening to a parent or not is beneficial for learning. And Laura, she has done a lot of work on those aspects. This is a talk about whether children are able to also contribute to their learning. So we are contrasting the situation where the parents know best to a situation in which the child also knows a few things that could help learning. And those things are, for example, when they are ready to learn something, or what they know or do not know. And basically what our work is doing is to try to demonstrate that infant behaviors are driven by or signal the state of epistemic curiosity, which we think is actually an optimal learning state, and we try to understand that. And then if any kind of coincidental information, whether it's extracted by a child themselves or given by a parent, will lead to better learning because it's coincidental to that optimal learning state. So basically this is a talk. So from now on it will just be data. The first way in which we approach this question of understanding epistemic desires in infancy is to look at different ways in which they signal or sign curiosity. And I'm making here this distinction between signs or signals. So there are, of course, behaviors that are an index of the child's epistemic state, but may not be intended to communicate that. While others, like showing and pointing, we might see them as being intended to request information. However, that is, this distinction, it's not very clear where the border is, and this distinction is not relevant here. As long as any of these behaviors are recognized by a parent or a caregiver as reflecting epistemic states, one way in which they could lead to more learning is by increasing the amount of information that the parent is giving. So child points a lot. That means if the parent recognizes that as reflecting desire to learn, parent will respond more and more learning. However, there's also another way in which more learning or better learning can result from this, and that is because we think that that's really what the child is signaling is this preparedness for learning. So there is a state, a neural state, which in itself is an optimal state for acquiring information. And then by input being tuned to these signals, they would lead to better learning. And the first study that we did was to demonstrate this. So what we used as a signal was children's pointing. And they gave them the opportunity to choose what they want to learn about. And these are things that novel objects, and that's a nice part of infancy research, and you get to create very funny things, novel objects. So infant was given the opportunity to choose by pointing which of the two objects they wanted to learn something about, and what they learn about is functions for those objects. And then what we did is demonstrate that function either for the object that they chose or the opposite of the other object. And then after a period of 5 minutes, we tested that knowledge with the delayed imitation paradigm. And this is just to convince you that infants actually produce those actions. So this is, for example, one of the actions they had to learn. They're all arbitrary actions, so brushing your hair. And it takes various amount of time, but we always gave them a lot of opportunities to demonstrate the action.
Sorry, how old are these kids?
Oh, sorry, these are 16 months old.
16 months old.
And so here the question is whether they will be able to demonstrate more of these actions for the object that they have asked. They pointed to as compared to the other one. And this is what happens. So there's a proportion, or a high proportion of actions correctly replicated for this for the chosen object. Now we also just to preempt any questions you might ask. So we did a lot of behavior coding just to see that there was no difference between the conditions, how long the infants attended to the actions, or how the actions were demonstrated, and that this the difference is due to their choice. And also we did additional control conditions to confirm that indeed we're dealing with better learning when action was demonstrated for the object they chose, and not poor learning when they were ignored, because that could also be a confound. There are also some questions that remain unanswered from this study, whether children really pointed to ask for information, or well, whether the motivation to acquire information didn't come maybe after the choice, whether they made a random choice because they were forced, but encouraged to, and then motivation maybe come subsequently. But we know that from other previous studies, that pointing is driven by the amount of information available, so children stop pointing if they are not offered information. So we believe that in this case also pointing was signaling this desire to learn. Now another aspect that we want to explore is to understand better this state. Yes?
I have a question about the previous data. So how did you rule out that they that learning was an outcome rather than a cause of the pointing? I mean, maybe kids have an idea about some of the objects and they like to explore those more.
But so there was no consistent choice across infants for one of the objects or the other?
What? No, but I mean, what did the kids have experience with those objects before you tested them?
No.
Oh, the very first time, completely new. They never touched them. They never held them before.
No. And the actions, I think there was also the way the actions were mapped on the object. There was no correspondence and it was counterbalance, so there was no affordance.
Okay. So, but what about prior familiarity effects? Like if kids are more, one kid is more familiar with something that looks like a brush than they want to see. They prefer the brush and they know ahead of time. They know better how to use that.
Okay, but so because there was no general consistent choice, maybe individual each child, their own personal history made them more familiar with one object or the other, but that is impossible to quantify. But also the control condition maybe actually represented that, where they were either demonstrated for all of them, so they didn't have to choose, but they demonstrated for all the objects, partially demonstrated or not, to allow that issue as well. So in the next set of studies, we're interested in understanding better the state that we think mediates the relation between these signals and learning. And just to give a little of background on other studies that have looked at neural mechanisms that mediate desire for information and subsequent learning, there's actually quite a bit of literature now coming from adult studies. It's generally in adult studies, the way they are motivated often is with monetary reward, so there's not an intrinsic motivation. And for example, we know that if offer more money, then the information is better retained, and that is mediated by, for example, increased amplitude of certain frontal ERPs, or increasing frontal theta rhythm activity, or hippocampal theta. More recently, there are also studies where the motivation was intrinsic and was assessed by asking participants whether they are interested or not in a piece of information. And again, that predicts whether the information will be retained. And also in that situation, this relation seems to be mediated by certain neural states. So there is more activation in a caudate nucleus, there's increased pupil dilation, and there are more activation in the hippocampus or nuclear accumbens. So there's, I think, for the time being, little work trying to integrate all these findings.
So what does it mean? So they are curious, that's why this, I don't understand exactly what the schema.
Yeah, it means there's increased activation in the...
But how do you measure if they are curious? Or
sorry? The nucleus?
The curiosity.
Oh, it's self-reported. So
okay.
they, for example, they're told how interested are you in knowing what the capital of...
Okay, so to the small kids is with the...
Yes. And they ask if they knew the information and how you can find it. So we wanted to demonstrate a similar relationship in infants. Of course, in infants, so just because this is the correlated we're going to be measuring in infants, and maybe some people in the audience are more expert in what this correlate means. So it seems to be an increased interest in this oscillatory activity in the brain, these theta regions that are measured with respect to learning. And basically, from what I understand, these are probably a result of cortico-subcortical loops, and this is what gives actually the frequency range of the theta regions, and have been associated across many studies with controlling or pacing the information sampling. So this is the reason why we were interested in looking at this correlate. And also we're going to be looking at pupil dilation, and we're going to be exploring this relation between information, the states, particularly neural states, and learning in two different studies, mainly because it's quite challenging in infants to do both steps, but you'll see why. So this is how we measure electroencephalography in infants, and what we will be looking in particular is at certain frequency band, either using time frequency analysis or just like an FFT. The first study where what we want to demonstrate is that this theta activity is actually modulated by the information content that the child is exposed to. And in order to modulate that, we used a situation that we knew from previous research is perceived as informative or not informative. So the infants were exposed to informant persons, so a person that knows what things are called, and a non-informant, which is a person that it's not that they know, but the other person is not giving them any information about the object. And the object in the familiarization, so when we teach them the one person is informative and the other one is non-informative, we always use familiar objects so that they can actually test that the information is accurate. And then these are 11 months old. So there are estimates from parental reports of what kind of which objects they would know the words for around that age. So this is how we chose the objects. And then the crucial manipulation is that we are going to measure whether this anticipatory states, theta activity, precedes actually the act of offering information. So after they've been familiarized with the two agents, they now see a novel object, either presented with the informant or the non-informant person. And we are measuring activity before the person is doing anything. And we'll see here, this is a time frequency plot. So this is frequency range, and this will be the frequency range of theta activity and time. And you see that in this condition, so this was the informant, the situation in which the person was going to offer information, there is more theta activity than in the other condition. And this is also just to confirm that the difference was significant, and we measured these differences both in frontal channels and in temporal channels. We also, because we used an eye tracker during the EEG testing, we also could measure pupil dilation, and we see that there is an increase in pupil just before the person was going to offer either information or not. And again, there's a higher increase in pupil dilation before for the informative person. There was also something we also wanted to measure, but we actually didn't find any difference, was any preference to look towards one or the other person during familiarization. So because there were a few trials of familiarization, so we thought, well, if infant is interested in gathering information from the informant, they would make a first saccade towards that person, and there was no difference. And one of the reasons, I think, is that eye movements are very cheap in a way, so making one shift in eye movements is not costly, because you can always go back to the person that you really want to look at. And these infants were not trained to choose with their eyes like monkeys are after thousands of trials. So here, importantly, because in both situations, the person was going to communicate something, but only in one situation the communication was informative. I think we demonstrate that increase in theta and pupil reflect this anticipation of communication. And we're following up now that we've really want to develop this as a marker of epistemic curiosity. So we can ask other questions, for example, whether even if given presented with information, can they not stop themselves from learning it if they know the information is not reliable. So if someone, for example, was demonstrated to mislabel things beforehand, or whether this anticipatory activity is modulated by whether information is learnable. So if we present them with someone that uses their own or a foreign language. So all this work is ongoing, and hopefully Katarina will soon go back and carry on the studies. We also asked this question that there's a missing part of this link between motivation for learning, epistemic curiosity, and learning, which is the link between this correlate and actual outcome of learning. So this is what we looked at in a separate study, and also in this study, this was a different manipulation, which now the child acquires information on their own by exploring objects. And we also wanted to ask whether this relationship is partially mediated by their actually exploratory activity, and whether what is this neural correlate really reflecting? Is it also driving seeking as much as learning? And that could tell us more about in which way it is helping learning. So in this study, infants were shown a variety of novel objects, again, so things that they had never experienced before, and they are led to explore these objects for a maximum, I think, 40 seconds, while we measure again their brain activity. And at the end of the exploration of all the objects, the way we measure learning is with a pair preference test, where we now show, so you see that in this case they are shown, this is the same object they were playing with here, and in this case the other object is slightly different from it. So Katarina again designed these objects so that they have minimal differences, so we really can test learning of their particular features. So what we then do here, again, we measure EG activity during exploration, and we want to relate it to novelty preference in the test. And however, because this the amount of theta we measure is not an absolute indicator of how much learning is going on, and we didn't have a baseline, we created a relative measure by splitting objects in those objects that elicit a lot of theta activity and objects that elicit very little theta activity, and then comparing novelty preferences for those two groups of objects. That is here. So this is the measure. So you will have difference in theta between objects that elicit highest and lowest, and then difference in novelty preferences for those objects. And then we're looking at all participants. And there is a very nice relationship between this brain activity and their subsequent learning. So this is how, so we close the circle, so we see that this correlate was modulated by information richness and also is the predictor of learning success. As you remember, we also had this question of what is the mechanism that relates theta activity and learning, and one way it could be that this just reflects this optimal state, this preparedness for learning, and then whatever information is coincidental will be better learned. It could also be that it this is activity that drives or stimulates exploration, and indeed we find a relation between amount of theta and the time that is spent exploring the object. So this is maybe a driver of information seeking. However, there was no relation between these two. So that is clearly not. This is not a mediator. This is not the only way in which theta activity relates to learning. But these are two parallel drives, and it's also possible that, of course, we are only measuring here time in object exploration, but it's possible that theta drives other kind of exploratory behavior that may be related to learning, as, for example, looking behavior. It's possible that what is crucial is not how much you explore something, but the way you visually explore it. However, I think that probably it's important to have demonstrated that these mechanisms are at play very early in infancy, but it's more important to understand a little bit what are we measuring and how why is learning benefiting from these neurocorrelates, and what is it that we're measuring? So is it some kind of general arousal or alertness that is measured? And this may be suggested by the fact that it's often frontal effects that are measured in infants and adults. And also there is some evidence from adults that even incidental information is better learned. So if an adult states that a certain piece of information is interesting, of course that will be better learned, but also incidental information presented with that will also be better learned. So maybe these states are not specific in any way. But it could also be that this activation is information specific, so the child is expecting a certain kind of information, and that is what drives learning. And indeed, again, in adult studies, they find different topography for this theta activation when participants expect emotion versus semantic information. So that would then just suggest that what we're seeing here is maybe an activation of those networks that will be involved in receiving that information, and this pre-activation will lead to better learning. It would be interesting to do this in infants. It would be possible to offer them different kind of information and see if that modulates topography of theta activation. But there are also more specific hypotheses about theta rhythms and how they may be involved in learning. And they are, there's evidence, for example, that the frequency of theta rhythms sometimes can be entrained to the frequency of information in the environment. But also that behaviors, for example, the frequency of information sampling may be tuned to the frequency of theta, or it happens at theta frequency. And this is what was observed in rats, for example, when they sniff around objects. They do it at the frequency of 3 to 6 times per second. And also eye movements, fixations are around 200 to 300 milliseconds. So that would be around 3 to 5 fixation per second. So again, a theta rhythm. So it's possible that actually the reason theta is present there is to allow this chunking of information, and that will result in better learning. So this is research that we have finished, completed, but we're also really, I think at this point, we're really trying to also understand what is the most interesting questions to ask about interest and curiosity. And of course, there's the question that was addressed in earlier talks is what makes something interesting, so what will drive information seeking. And we have made some attempts to look at that, which were actually not most successful, and now changing a little bit the way we approach this. So, for example, there was some earlier work on what kind of objects drive or attract infant attention. In 1975, Martin showed that more complex objects, infants look more at objects that had more complex patterns. So we try to replicate that, and whatever object you think is more interesting of these ones, this is not what infant stuff. So actually we found absolutely no preference for the objects that we thought were more complex. But these were, we asked children to, I think, crawl towards one, or point towards one or the other. What we will try to explore further is more from this point of view of we're creating a knowledge gap and prediction errors driving information seeking, and it's one of the issues that I initially saw with this account is that for infants, everything, well, a lot of things initially are new. I mean, there's a point at which everything is new. So it's very different to have a prediction error for something for which you cannot make a prediction. But it's also true that maybe initially representations are much more fuzzy. So in a way, everything looks like everything else, and one can always make a prediction about how an object is going to behave, even if it only vaguely looks like a previous encountered object, which will probably in most cases be followed by a violation expectation that will lead to seeking of information. And also the last aspect that we're very interested in is understanding the difference between state and trait curiosity. So all the work that I present now was about states of epistemic curiosity and all the work that was presented this morning. But there's also individual difference in how thirsty for knowledge we are. And those are observing adults when they self-report on that, but also we can measure differences in how much infants can point. So if you have an infant in a play situation with their mother, you can measure from this, how long was this? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes of interaction, some infants had up to 30 pointing events, while others had almost none. And also, this is the blue bars is amount of pointing. What's interesting here, we also measured maternal responsiveness in this nursery, whether the mom responded to the pointing gesture. And we see there's also a little bit of variation. So there are dyads where mother almost always responds, even if the child is not pointing that much, but also dyads in which the mother responds. In some cases, doesn't respond to the child's pointing. And so the question that will be interesting is in understanding this individual variability and understanding especially whether it's driven by biological differences, and there's no research from other species linking, for example, a dopamine gene polymorphisms to exploration activities, and so that could be what drives this trait curiosity in humans as well. But we also think that their environment has a role in that, and that's where the maternal responsiveness comes in. And we want to explore to which extent how much responsiveness they receive to their pointing will modulate up or down their curiosity levels. And then if that proves to be a way to modulate curiosity, that is also a way to improve it. And this is
so thank you for this very interesting talk. In the talk I'm going to do after, one of the hypotheses I'm studying is that actually maybe part of the response to what is interesting is a situation where you are experiencing learning. Mm-hmm. And is this something you consider? Because actually here you've actually studied the other direction, like when you are interested, it is
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
fostering learning, but did you consider that there might be a bidirectional interaction?
Yeah, so there's probably fluctuation in those in theta reading depending on whether they are learning or have given up on learning. Right? So this is, we're exploring a stable state in which we expect them to learn, but I don't know whether we can observe that in an experimental situation.
So maybe, so it means in the kind of experimental setup you deal with the infants, is there a way you can measure learning?
So we are, it's all, if you measure theta, it's all a question of how much data you need to get a signal from noise. So here I think we have 6 trials that you need to average to get signal from noise. So whether you can have an infinite 10-minute situation where their learning state changes and you can still measure enough data for you to see signal. I think that's, we can always try, but I'm not sure. It's always a limitation of, and all studies that want to measure change in learning is the fact that you need a number of trials to actually measure signal. So you need to average, and then averaging kills this.
Yeah.
And your, oh sorry.
No, no.
In your question at the end about variability, what's the level of within subject variance compared with the between subject variance? Because you showed us subjects as a single bar, and I wonder if you compare them in many different sessions across weeks, whether you would have that each individual is not self-consistent to a great degree.
Yeah, we have not done that. And I'm sure there are many different variables that could influence the rate of learning. And maybe that's an interesting question, for example, what is fatigue, whether if you have them at the end of the day, would they point less, and what is exactly is explaining that. But I think the way we, it's important to get a stable state, and I think we'll have to repeat measures to be sure that what we're measuring is the individual state of our trait, curiosity. But we're also interested in more longitudinal relationships, so whether what you measure now and what you measure 6 months from now will be related to each other.
Yeah. You may be interested in making contact. I don't know if you're familiar. There's a lot of popularity at the moment in behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology, in what people call personality in animals, which effectively refers to variability. And there are some theoretical models for how it could emerge. The problem there is not mechanistic, it's actually functional. The standard problem in evolution is that the naive models of natural selection say that there shouldn't be heritable variance, because if there is something which is better than anything else, then everybody should be doing it. And of course it is. And so there are lots of models for how variance in a population can be maintained and whether it should be. But there are theoretical models for that that would speak to your question of why is there variability. But in all cases, what you require is, the basic thing is measures of self-consistency. You need to know that one individual is consistently more variable, so it's more consistent with self than with others.
But I mean, there are reasons why one should keep variabilities, because environments can be different than in child development. So we're not talking about changes, environmental changes in the weather, but the family environment can be.
Well, that's an approximate explanation of how variability is generated.
Yeah. So, and there are situations when maybe the child should not extract too much information from the environment if the information is bad. So if they grow up in a very.
So what I'm trying to say is that in the animal literature, there is data of heritable variation in exploratory tendencies. And you can select for that in generations of, for example, of great eats on some small bird. People started this field because they noticed that some animals sampled all over the territories and others were more conservative, and you could select that across generations. So the phenomenon does exist. Whether it's meaningful or not is another issue. So it would be good to compare the two literatures in that respect. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
I find it really interesting that you said when you compared these two objects and saw if infants were pointing at a more complex one, that you didn't find any preference there, because the looking time preference for more complex stimuli is very, very well established and has been replicated many times. So I just wonder if you would think that pointing at an object and looking at an object are two fundamentally different ways of engaging with that, and that perhaps in terms of pointing, that the more complex object was, if we assume that infants go for an intermediate level of complexity, that it was off the chart in a sense in terms of complexity, or just what you make of this difference between the looking and the pointing data.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know whether the complexity was off the chart. We didn't manipulate in a way that is quantifiable, so other tools have done it. But I mean, it could be that indeed different mechanisms use the drive amount of looking and manipulation for us, because we want to use these behaviors also as a cue for parental input. A choice, a manual choice of pointing in a way is more functional, more relevant, because that would be something that the parent can read, while maybe the amount of looking is a more subtle cue. So.
And it could of course be if there's a super complex object that the infant would think, well, if mom explains the function of this object to me, I wouldn't even get it because it looks so complex. Because the others clearly seem to have a function. But
yeah, I think then we need to quantify. Yeah. It's better than what we did to answer this question.
It's really cool work, and I'm thinking of John Gabrielli. I think has also another funny about preparedness for learning in your list of things where you can sort of track the parahippocampal activation and actually present the stimuli. It just naturally fluctuates. And if you happen to present stimuli at a high point versus a low point, people differentially then remember it. So it seems extremely plausible that babies is a different preparedness in affecting learning. But I'm wondering about a subtle, because pointing is such a complicated gesture. It can indicate that you want information, but it can also indicate that you're prepared to engage, right? And that you want to engage in a communicative context about something. And the experiment with the communicative and uncommunicative partner, it's true it's not any kind of communication, that's true, but it still feels like it's an instance of, oh, we're gonna engage in some conversational partnership here about this object. So I guess I'm wondering how you or what your thoughts are about pointing as asking for information versus pointing as in I want to show something to you, you're going to show something to me, I want to show something to you, you're going to show something to me. Sort of part of a general bid for sort of social joint attention.
And why would that lead to better learning? Is then you
well,
because you're
the measure of learning is in some sense a demonstration of knowledge also, right? So like you learn something because you're still in that communicative mode.
But because the partner is the same for both the chosen and non-chosen object.
And because the child is continuing to demonstrate, right? Like so if you're again, I find it incredibly plausible. I'm just wondering how you disentangle in this case a kind of basically a more pedagogical, interactive kind of thing that's going on in these moments from strict preparedness for learning or intentional, especially because you wanted to suggest that it wasn't just about attention, but attention deviation.
Okay, so one way in which we will try to address this is by actually measuring these theta states in conjunction to pointing and to see whether they accompany.
But you might still wonder what both theta and pointing in humans were.
Sorry?
Both theta and pointing might be indexing just preparedness to learn, or it could be preparedness to engage with someone preparedness to engage in joint attention, basically.
But yes, but also in that study there's always joint attention, so even when they were demonstrated the function for the other object, there was always interaction. So they could anticipate. There was no different anticipation of interaction with the person.
In that case, where the communicative cue was not informative, or it was just
in the pointing study, sorry. So when they were demonstrating the function for the object they pointed to or the other object, in both cases, that was followed by interaction. So it couldn't be their expectation for interaction that drove the learning in that situation.
Right. No, I mean, it's definitely, it's a very, very subtle distinction. It's just, but one is
Yeah,
one
no,
is
because
very
we
directed out.
we had to argue
Yeah.
very strongly about that. It was quite a painful process. I don't know if you have other thoughts about it.
Well, another thing is with the previous study, we did we manipulated whether the person was correctly or incorrectly labeling familiar objects, and then we just had novel objects popping up in the background, and infants pointed a lot more when they were interacting with a knowledgeable person versus an unknowledgeable. So, and again, in both cases, if they pointed, the person responded and showed them the object, and labeled even the object, so the expectation should be the same, but they didn't point unless they could expect that the information they will receive was actually.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. I felt like I was just tuned in at the moment. It was an exclamation line. I had a moment of not prepared.
So we can take this up later in an extended discussion, so I think we should move on. Okay, so Teodora will speak next on the impact of curiosity-driven learning on self-organization of the developmental process, and we'll talk about robotics